Hi and welcome to Squizzcom, the connected marketplace. For this episode 7, I'll be showing you the latest changes we've made to the platform over the last month or so. To begin with, we've added a new feature that allows organizations to be able to retrieve product data, pricing, and stock quantities off any other organizations who are registered on the platform and they are connected to. By one business being able to retrieve all the available product information off another business directly through the platform's API, that's short for Application Programming Interface, it can greatly reduce the amount of time that would otherwise be required by people having to manually set up information for products such as names, descriptions, and many other things. Through Squiz.com's API, organizations can automate the transfer of data between suppliers and customers' systems, cutting cost, reducing errors, and allowing products to be sold or purchased quicker. It can eliminate the need to manually pass around spreadsheets and documents of data, such as PDFs, as well as simplify integrating data between systems. To show you an example of the API in action, in this diagram I have here, we have a typical real-world case scenario where we have one supplier, which is called the donut company, and the other organization is Quickie Mart, which is a customer who purchases donuts off the donut company. So the donut company, in this case, they manufacture donuts as well as other baked goods. And the Quickie Mart purchase these donuts and sell these goods to end consumers onto other businesses as well. So we have these two companies. They've both registered within the Squiz.com platform, and they've both connected their business systems into the platform through its API. Each business could have their own different accounting or ERP system that stores information about their business, and they could be, in this case, using a connector in order to translate the data between the API and that business system on both sides. So they could be completely different systems. So in the first case, the donut company, in its system, it will have to generate products and other pieces of information about the products themselves. So somebody in the donut company has created the product data, and they've also created some product pricing, and they also set up stock quantities that are available for these donuts and other baked goods that have been made. So the first step is the donut company would push their product data as well as pricing and stock quantities up into the Squiz.com platform. So in this case, the data would flow through the connector, in through the API and into the Squiz.com platform where it can be then purchased. And this happens for the pricing and the stock quantity availability. Now, if Quickie Mart has made a connection to the donut company, then it can be allowed to then pull this information down and retrieve the information and push it down into its own system. So in this case, the product information throws through the API, down through the connector, and then it can be then pushed somewhere around within the Quickie Mart's computer network, maybe into its own business system, or it can sit in other locations. So Quickie Mart now has the ability to pull down the product information, the stock quantities, as well as the product pricing. So as you can see here, we now have copies of this data that has flowed between the supplier, in this case the donut company, Squiz.com, and the Quickie Mart. Now the connector can consistently call the API to retrieve the latest data that is available and to overwrite that data that's previously set in their systems. And as well, the donut company can continually push up new information into the platform that allows it to be retrieved and downloaded as it gets changed. So if once stock quantities get adjusted for products, then the donut company can then reduce the stock quantities and then put a change up into Squizz and then allow Quickie Mart to download those changes from the connector or any other business system that can talk directly with the API. So to make this happen in a real case scenario, Quickie Mart can choose to configure the connector, that's the Squiz.com connector, to retrieve this data, or it can configure its own business system software in order to make calls to the API itself and then handle that data retrieval. And it's up to Quickie Mart to decide which is the best approach based on their systems. To set this up, a new endpoint has been created in the API called Request Organization Data. And we can see the information about that if we go back to the Squiz.com webpage. If you scroll down the page and click on the Help section, within the Help and Documentation Center, if we go down to the Platform API, within the Platform API page, there's a new section that's been added called Retrieve Organization Data. And this provides a description on how you can call the API endpoint, what the URL needs to be in order to be able to make a request by a piece of software to be able to retrieve this product information. So there's a few parameters that are required in the URL in order to make this possible. And you can see the kind of data that will be returned is in form of the JSON data type, which is short for JavaScript Object Notation, which you can see an example of here. And there's one property called data records, return a list of product data that one organization is requesting. So there's 3 different kinds of data that can be requested. That is either product data, product customer account pricing, so that's pricing of products based on the relationship you have with the supplier of the products, as well as product stock quantities. So the products was going to contain information of all the products that are available. So in this case, Cookie Mart can retrieve all the product information off the donut company, as well as separately retrieve the pricing off the donut company for all those products, and separately get the stock quantities. When that could be useful if then Cookie Mart is on selling the stock, or it's drop shipping the products directly from the donut company to the end consumer who's buying the donuts. Besides that, there is a few other configurations. So we need to specify who is the supplying organization, we're going to be retrieving the product information from. We need a session created in the API first before we can retrieve the information. We also have got optional parameters where we want to start retrieving data. So this API endpoint for retrieving data has a fixed limit of 5,000 records that can be retrieved at any one time. So if the donut company was selling 10,000 products, we would have to make 2 requests in order to get the 5,000 records in chunks. So we can change where we want to start getting records from within the overall result set. As well, we can also restrict how many records you want to be returned from the API. So you can set this parameter, say maybe you only want to get 1,000 products of the 5,000 at any one given time. So that way your system or software can then handle it. If you are getting pricing of a supplying organization and you have multiple accounts set up, so an account defines what the price of a product will be, then you can also specify an account code. And that will dictate what the pricing of the products you can purchase them at. But that's only optional if there are multiple accounts and the organization supplying the data has assigned the other organization to multiple accounts. Also note, when calling this API endpoint, there is a small trading tokens cost in order to retrieve the data. So that cost is 10 tokens per API request plus 1 token per 1,000 records retrieved. And so that's a maximum of 15 tokens per request. And this cost will help Squizz pay for the servers and the resources to enable the API to be running all the time in a high availability fashion. So at the time this video was made, each request cost 10 cents in Australian currency, or the maximum of 15 cents. And that's a very small cost in order to allow to retrieve this data and do a lot of automation. You can find more information about trading tokens and any pricing by clicking on the link within the API endpoint, which will show you a table that shows of all the costs as organizations use and leverage the platform's various features and functionality. Now to see this in action, so here's our organization called the Donut Factory. And if we go there, we can see that the Cookie Mart has connected. So they made a connection request. They've found each other through this mechanism, and those connections have been accepted. Now we can also see that Donut Factory has previously uploaded their product information. So if we go to the products tab, you can see that the Donut Factory in this case has uploaded 8 different products. And if we go into any product, such as this bun, we can see a whole bunch of different pieces of information that is available. So in this case, this product has this product code, it has a search code, it has a barcode set, as well as brand and other information about its weight and size, and tax code that's been set against it. And we can see that in this case, the Donut Factory has 20 that are in stock. Now to receive the data retrieval in action, we have the connector application. So that's the Squizzcom Connector application. And this has a feature within it under the tools section called the JSON XML query browser. So in the connector is a .NET, a Microsoft .NET application that can run on Windows-based computer. And we have these different query browsers that can actually query data from different kinds of places where data is stored. So ODBC means we can get it from a database that supports the ODBC protocols. We can get it from a Microsoft SQL server, or we can get it from a XML or JSON web service or file that stores data in this format. So I've opened the JSON XML query browser here, and we can see that it's going to read a JSON document. So that's the form in which the API, the Squizzcom API, saves the data in. In this case, it's going to make a request, just like how you would in a web browser to open up a web page. It's going to do the same process in order to make a request to the API on the Squizz platform. So we can choose in order to get this data from different locations. We could get it from the file if it was saved on the local computer. We can get it from a computer or a server which is on the internet, or we can actually place the data within a tab down below in order to read the data straight from there. Separately, we can also use this query browser in order to query data, XML-based data, so that's data stored in a tree-based or a hierarchical format from a file, from a server that is living on the across the internet or a computer network, or we can get it from the data stored within this query browser itself. So at the moment, I've got it set to request. I've set up the URL to retrieve the data from the API, and I've set the organization we're going to retrieve the data from. So this is the ID. In this case, we want the Kwik-E-Mart to be able to retrieve the product information from the donut company. So this is the ID of the donut company. By putting the data type ID, I'm specifying the kind of data I want to retrieve. So in this case, number 3 represents products. So I want to get product data retrieved. And we also have here that we need to have in the URL is a session ID. So in a previous query, I've called the API to create a session. It's returned back this identifier. I can then now put this in the URL, and then now I can call this API endpoint. Now we have some other things in the query browser. So if we require to set any request headers, that's additional information that we need to use when calling any kind of server. We can set the timeout, so how long will we wait for the server on the internet or on a computer network to return data. And this JSON record set path, we can say once the data is returned, what data should we look through? What record should we look through within the JSON data that is being returned? So in this case, it's going to try to find an attribute within the returned data called data records, and it's going to iterate through a list or an array of those records, which is assigned to that property. The final part here in the query browser, we can also request the kinds of information for each individual field. All these data fields are doing is specifying, here's the name of the field that we're looking to get, and that's going to be displayed within the table below. So if I just scroll up here, so this is very similar to if you ever written a database query using the SQL query language, you would specify the database you want to retrieve the data from. So that's what in this case what the URL is doing. You then specify the table that you want to get the data from. So that's this is kind of what the record set path is doing. And then you would specify in the fields or the columns that you want to retrieve the information for, which columns you want to get the data out. So that's what all these fields here are doing. So when I click the run query, it's going to make a request to the Squizzcom API server. That's going to return back a response, and it's going to return back the data if all is gone well. So in this case, it has, and we can see the data that has been returned. So it has managed to find the amount of quantity of stock that is available that the donut factory is selling to Kwik-E-Mart. So we can see here, we got 20 in stock. We got a description. So in this case, the first product here is bagels. And we can see other pieces of information. Here's the products names. So they're selling bagels, blue donuts, multigrain buns. The same information that we saw back here in the Squizzcom platform. So all this information just in another form within this table structure based here that has been queried out. So this shows you an example of how you can use the query browser to get the data. We can also see what the raw data, so in this case, this was the JSON data that I was talking about in its raw form that it's been returned by the API endpoint. So we could then eliminate and reduce the amount of data that we actually care about in the query. So we could get rid of the barcode field if we wanted to. We could also get rid of the brand, and then we could completely cut down the query. And what this would mean, if we look here, so we don't need the average cost. When we run it again, you can see that it's removed those columns that are no longer relevant. Now the typical use case is, say the Quickie Mart buys products off the donut company and on-sells them, they're going to want to change this information from the donut company. So an example might be, in the descriptions, the donut company has put their name within the descriptions themselves. And the Quickie Mart may not want to show the name of that organization who's supplying those donuts. So within the query browser, we can set up functions against the fields in order to manipulate the data that has been returned. In the Connector Documentation Center and go into the generic adapter page, we can see that there are a number of functions that exist that we can use in order to then manipulate the data that is being displayed in this query browser or being returned from the donut company. So one of those functions is called replace. So what we can do is we can try to find a piece of text and replace that with another piece of text. So if we go back to the query browser, we can say for the description 1 field, we want to put a replace function in, and we want to replace whatever comes in that field. We want to find the text where it displays the donut factory, and we want to replace that text with, we could replace it with Quickie Mart. So when we run that again, you can see that the donut factory's name in the product descriptions has now been changed to become the Quickie Mart organization name within the product descriptions. Now we can use the same concept. If we look at the product codes, we can see here that the donut factory has put this prefix of TDF- in front of the product codes as well to denote that that is the donut factory's products. But maybe the Quickie Mart wants to remove TDF and replace that with their own prefix code. So if we go to the product code field and we use the same concepts, we can write a replace function. So we've got a rule now in place that says replace the TDF for the donut factory's prefix, and now instead it's putting in KWK. So in the product search code, which had the before code, you can see there, and the product search code here, you can see the after. Now you can do other stuff besides just replacing. We could also remove the prefix altogether, so we could change that TDF and put just a blank, and then in this case, we might want to get rid of that dash as well, so we can remove the donut factory's their prefix code, as we can see here. We could concatenate, and we could add fields together. So in this case, we've got this field called product class. So we could put the bagel, append that after, and set that as a suffix. And we run that, and now you can see that the product code now has bagel, the product code plus the product class. So this is a great example of how you can manipulate the data coming out of one organization and then change it to meet your own organization's needs. Another case could be where the stock quantity, so it's showing as 20 for everything, but you want to keep, maybe Quickie Mart wants to keep a bit of stock up their sleeve and don't want to make all stock available. So they could change and alter that by doing a calculation. So we can use the other function that's available called calc, and where we could do a formula where we wanted to minus 2 from whatever the stock quantity that the donut factory had. So in this case, once we run that, you can see that's been now reduced to 18. And you can do very complex, so you can write mathematical formulas within this calculate function that can do very advanced calculations based on different fields that are and different data that's available. So this gives you an overview of how you can use the connector, its query browser, in order to be able to retrieve data from web services and different hierarchical based data in XML and JSON forms. We can convert them into table structures. We can manipulate the data that's coming out, and then we could also use the connector to then push that data back into the platform within the Quickie Mart's organization, which can then show on their own profile under the products that they sell. So at the moment, if we once we've made our changes, we can retrieve the product data from the donut factory, manipulate it, and then push it back up within the Quickie Mart's profile and sell those products that are available. And we can also put in where clauses to say we don't care about half the products that are available that the donut factory sells. So maybe we don't want to capture the bagels, so we want to leave the bagels and maybe the buns out as well. So in this case, we could do a where clause that says ignore retrieving data where the product class is not equal to donuts. So we can change this clause. So at the moment, it's getting all data records. It's coming out of the JSON data. We want to restrict it based on the product class field. So we put in this where clause, get all records from the JSON document where the product class field is equal to donut. And when we run that, we can see that it's only getting out 3 products as opposed to full result set, which is maybe relevant because only the Quickie cares about the donuts that are being sold. But if you look at the raw data tab, you can still see that the query, when it was made to the Squizzcom API, it's still pulling out all the information. It's just that the query browser itself is then restricting that information down. And then if we had the connector then pushing this information back up to Squizz to denote that Quickie Mart is selling these products, then it could exclude the products that are not required. So all these configurations can be set up within the connector as well to be able to do that pushing and pulling mechanism and data manipulation. I would recommend that if you are playing around with this tool, it's good to just query the data once, and then once it's queried, then it will get placed within the raw data tab. Then we can change the read document from the raw tab as opposed to then having to repeatedly make queries across to the web server, which is going to chew up costs and resources. And then it also gives you great flexibility in being able to play around with that data. You could also then copy it and save it across into files and then pass those files around. Additionally, in the query browser, you could then copy all the table data, and you could then paste that into a spreadsheet file where if you wanted to run formulas or do some kind of manipulation so they can be imported into other systems, there's also that capability if you need it as well. So have a play with the query browser, and it's a great tool in order to understand the data coming out of the API as well as being able to manipulate the data in various forms. Now in the future, we'll be also looking at adding other advanced functionalities to be able to then save the product data to the connector itself and then import that into other external systems in one fluid motion. So stay tuned for the next set of connector changes and releases that will be coming up this year. If we call the other 2 endpoints within the Squiz.com API, so the other one endpoint is the pricing, so we can retrieve all the pricing of the products. So in this case, Quickie Mart wants to know all the pricing that they get for the products if they purchase them off the donut company. So here we can see that when we call that endpoint, so here's the data that gets returned from that. So we get the price of a product, we get the product, the unique identifier of the product, according to Donut Factory. So we can see product 1, that's unique identifier, so that was a donut, and that has a price of $11. And the other product, so product 2, is $15. So using the 2 API endpoint, we should be able to match up the products. So in this case, product 1 was a pink donut, and then the second API endpoint says that donut can be purchased for $15. And if the donut company had any quantity break discounts, such as if you order over 5, you get it for, in this case, for $10 or another amount, then we would see quantity amounts being placed here. So it is important to note that you can have multiple records for one product that can have multiple prices based on how much you order. So you can see the rules in which allow you to purchase more. As part of that endpoint, there is also this attribute in the JSON data called quantity break direction. So different companies, they apply quantity breaks in different ways. So in this case, it's saying for the donut company, you have to order over, say if we had a quantity of 5 here, you'd have to order over 5, so 6 or more, in order to get a reduced price, say if it was $10. Different companies may have the quantity break equal to or above or below a certain threshold. So it's important to look at that field if you're writing software and determine the right amount that is required for the quantity break to become applicable. The also important thing to note is that you must be assigned to a customer account. So if we go back to Squiz.com and go into the donut company, it has to assign, in this case, for the organization, it has to assign a customer account to the Quickie Mart itself in order to be able to price the products. Otherwise, the platform has no idea what is the applicable price for the donut company's products because there could be multiple prices based on different price levels and quantity breaks. So that's an important thing to note when calling that endpoint. Now, just like how we did with products, where you could manipulate the data coming back, you could also do it for pricing. So we could say, well, we want to mark up the price by $2. So then we could do a calc function here. Once again, we could use that to then automate the pricing of product data coming out of the API and when we want to push pricing data back up and on-sale product information. So the other endpoint that we added to the Squizzcom API is the ability to retrieve stock quantity information about products. So in this case, if we look at the query browser again, we can see for these different products, we can see the stock quantity that is available. So this endpoint is a very simplified version of the products data retrieval, and it only contains the quantity that's available for given products. So there could be a chance that you would call this endpoint more often if you're on-selling products and you want to have near real-time stock level or stock quantity information to make sure that you're not running out of stock within another supplying organization. Once again, you can then adjust the stock availability to your own needs using this endpoint as well. The other new feature we've added to the platform is for the organization supplying the product data and information to be able to restrict what products are available to certain organizations and people for viewing as well as purchasing. So in this case, we've got a number of products that the donut company is selling, but we may, for the Quickie Mart, they want to restrict the products that are available to the Quickie Mart. So the new feature that we've added into the Squizzcom platform is if you go into the admin section for a given organization, there is another icon called data sharing policies. So what data sharing policies are a set of rules in which you can choose on how to restrict what products are available to other people and organizations. So by default, every organization registered in Squizz will have 2 data sharing policies already set up. There's one to be able to share all information, so allow, in this case, the Quickie Mart to be able to download and get any kind of product information, or the complete opposite, which is to allow no data to be shared at all. So if we go into the details of a data sharing policy, there's a number of fields that are available here. So we've got a number of permissions if whether or not any organizations or people assigned to this data sharing policy are allowed to view products. They're allowed to view different pieces of information about each, or the fields that are available for each product. So whether or not they're allowed to see the name, the product code, any of the description fields, or view the brand and the dimensions and so on, as well as there's permissions of whether or not an organization is allowed to view the pricing of a product. So they may not want to allow organizations to view pricing. They can only see the product themselves, which is particularly important if you're a wholesaler and you don't want the end consumer to be able to see the pricing, as well as permissions whether or not you want to allow purchasing to occur. And same for backordering. So if you run out of stock, do you want to allow people to still be able to buy products? And as well as drop shipping. So if you want organizations to be able to order on behalf of another consumer and have the goods ordered direct to the end consumer. So there's all these permissions that control that. And we can see this in action if we just change one of these fields. So in this case, if we go look at our query browser, so we've got one field which is the stock quantity. Maybe we don't want the Quickie Mart to be able to see the stock quantity. So if we go in and change the data sharing policy, there's a field here for not allowing the stock quantity to be allowed to be viewed. So if we save that, now if we go back into the query browser and run the query again, we can see now that it's taken the stock quantity data away from the column, so it has no longer provide that in the raw data that was coming back from the API endpoint, as well as the stock low quantity, because that's also associated with stock availability. So looking at this, the donut company can pick and choose what pieces of information they want to make available. So the way that this works is that one data sharing policy is set as the default policy. And you can set one data sharing policy to be the default. Now you may want to assign different organizations to different data sharing policies. So at the moment, if you go into the organizations and you click on the relationship of any given organization, you can see that there is now a field called data sharing policy where we can explicitly assign a policy which is going to control the products and the information that that organization is allowed to see. By having it set to the default, then it's going to use the default policy assign against the group that that organization is assigned to. So Quickmart's assigned to customers. In the customers organization groups, you can also set a data sharing policy. So in this case, we may set for both the organizations assigned to the customers that they would be set to the share no data. So that policy would then apply to both these organizations unless they had an override to say that they allowed a specific policy instead. What this can do is reduce the amount of effort required in order to set up and control what kind of data can be accessed by which organization. Now, if the group is also set to default, then the default data sharing policy would be used that is assigned here. So one policy can only be the default across a given organization, and the default is used for any organizations or people who are not connected to the organization. Now, there may become circumstances where you want to add exceptions, where in this case, if we look at the share no data data sharing policy, we may want to put out a rule that says they're not allowed to see anything except when the product code, or in this case, let's say the product class, is equal to donut. So what this means is when the product, for every single product that the donut company sells, if its class matches donuts, then an override saying that yes, this product can be viewed, the stock quantities can be viewed, the pricing can be viewed, and it can be purchased, and you can customize to the best fit. So once we save that, we can have multiple exceptions. So in this case, we could target all products that have this class set to donut. We could add another rule that says when the barcode is set to a value, or the name starts with a certain string or ends with, or we can even set the product is within a list, which is separated by commas, or if it's a number. So if the width is greater than a certain amount, then we can put in all these different permission rules. And so you can add a whole bunch of exceptions into what is available. So once we've added our exception rules, we've applied that to this case to share no data. So the default is no data is available for all the organizations or people assigned to that data sharing policy, except for when the product contains the donut class. And in this case, that data sharing policy is assigned to the customers group, share no data. So what we should see, if we go back into the query browser, is we should see this list. Currently, we've got 8 products that are being shared. That is now going to get reduced to only the products that contain the class that is equal to donut, which is 3 products. And we refresh that, you can see that now we have only 3 products that are available to be viewed, and the permission saying which fields and which data is allowed to be returned back here. So you can see there's been a lot of restrictions put on what data is now available. So this is a great way for suppliers of data and organizations who are creating the data to be able to control which other people and organizations are able to access it. Now, the other part of the data sharing policies is there's a number of settings around if organizations themselves are allowed to retrieve data from the API. So we have this allowed product data exports. So that allows Quickmart, if that's set to no, then the Quickmart is no longer able to retrieve data at all from the API. So if we try to run that, then you can see that no data is returned, and now the API is returning an error saying that there's a permission denied error. So Quickmart has not been allowed by the donut factory to retrieve data anymore. So that's what that setting controls, and it's the same that can be done for the product stock quantities and the product pricing retrievals. Now, the other part is that an organization supplying data can also say how many times within a 24-hour period will they pay for another organization to retrieve the data. So they could say in a 24-hour period, the Quickmart is allowed to make 3 requests to retrieve their product data, the donut factory's product data, and they will pay on behalf of Quickmart to allow that retrieval to take place. But any more requests made by the Quickmart, then they will have to pay the trading tokens in order to be able to get that data. So this is a way for suppliers of organizational data to be able to subsidize the costs to allow customers to get the data over a given amount of time with any one 24-hour window. So if a supplier don't want to subsidize and pay for any data retrieval, they can set this to 0, and that will force the customers to have to pay. So it really depends on the relationships that are set up between suppliers and customers to see who's required to pay in order to retrieve this data and then to utilize it. And it's a protection mechanism in place as well. So that gives you an idea about the data sharing policies. When you do requests through the APIs, you'll be able to look at the transactions and be able to see when you have had to pay and how much you've had to pay to be able to retrieve the data. So in this case, the Wikimart has had to, there's a number of requests here that they were required to pay for that. It's worthy keeping an eye on the balances. And to do that, you really only want to be calling the API to get new data when it's really required, when it's necessary. It's up to you to work out the best strategy to take place. So that gives you a wrap up of the 2 new features that we've added, both the data retrieval through the API, allowing software systems between organizations to be able to automate those processes, and also using the data sharing policies against an organization to be able to control what data is allowed to be shared. To find more information about data sharing policies, if you go to the Help and Documentation Center and click on the organizational data link, there's a section has been added called Data Sharing Policies, where you can find out more information about the data sharing policies and what all the data sharing settings and configurations do when playing around with the data sharing policies. If you have any questions, you can also post a question on the Squizzcom feeds. The other feature we've added to the platform is this tool called the Address Cleaning Tester. So if organizations send purchase orders through the API, sometimes they will put address information which is in a not ideal state. So an example might be if we've got an address called 123 Main Street, and that has the suburbs such as, let's just put in Sydney, but then somebody's put in the state of Victoria as opposed to New South Wales, and they've stuck it in that field. And they've left the state, region, province field in the address empty, and they haven't set the country region. But they have set the correct postcode for Sydney. And then, so what we can do with this tool is to check how would the platform, because the platform has the ability to clean up address data in purchase orders being procured by suppliers, to see how would the platform, would it clean it up? So in this case, we can see that we've got address 1, which is our street address 2 is our suburb, and then New South Wales actually wasn't in any of the address data, but has been managed to be able to match up the state based on the postcode. So that's what the platform, it's a service that the platform provides, and it's put in the correct state province, and it's also removed the incorrect state, which was Victoria. And so we know that the platform is able to set the correct information, allowing that to reduce the errors that would have otherwise been introduced when orders are flowing between suppliers and customers' system. So this tool can help diagnose and work out ways on how the platform is doing that address cleanup, and over time we'll be extending it to be smarter again and to do further validation on addresses to try to work out what is the correct address going through the system. Now, organizations don't have to turn that feature on, so that's a setting which is configurable in the organization settings. That's this clean imported sales order address. That doesn't need to be turned on. You could leave it up to the end when the order goes through to a supplier's business system or the freight software in order to do that address fixing. But it is a facility that is available in the platform. The other feature that we've added, if you set up a smart freight provider, so in earlier episodes, we've talked about how you can have orders flowing through across into smart freight and then onto freight carriers. We've added another feature where you can set or specify if the purchase order number or the sales order code should be set in the freight order, which ultimately leads to the label and the reference that could be placed on the packaging of a product that is then sent to the end customer. So we've added this setting where you can then decide if you want the sales order code, because that allows a supplier to be able to find and track the reference of a delivery, or you want to put in the originating purchase order number from the customer who's buying the goods and display that on the sticker that comes on or the reference that comes on the delivered goods, so that way the end customer can reference that delivery back with the original purchase order that they created in their system. So there's that setting that is available there. And that gives you a wrap-up of all the changes we've made to the Squiz.com platform. If you have any questions or comments, please go to the Squiz.com profile, which can be found by clicking on the profile link and leaving a comment in the Squizz Early Adopters feed where we with your feedback or your comments, or if you find any issues while using the platform. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy squizzing.